Welcome to Mother and Refuge. Today we present Don Bosco's prophecy reveals the secret that will change the history of the Church of the 21st century. As shared by the Virgin Mary Forums. What is the key to overcoming the current confusion of the Church according to Don Bosco? St. John Bosco had several visions about the future, which were told by him in the form of dreams. Dreams have always been means through which heaven communicated messages. The dreams of Jacob and St. Joseph, among others, are famous, and Don Bosco prophesied the future of the Catholic Church through a dream, which he described as a parable, and he did it thinking especially of our time. We are talking about the famous dream of the two columns, which on one hand is a harbinger of what is happening and will happen in the Church following the events of the 20th century, and on the other hand, it vividly shows what strategies will ultimately produce the triumph of the Church of Christ. To the point that we could see in it the sterility of the synod of synodality and the like, and the weakness that comes from not anchoring in the values that made Christianity strong in these 20 centuries. Here, we will talk about what is the invaluable guide that Don Bosco's dream of the two columns gives us for the current moment of the Church. In May 1862, Don Bosco saw a great battle at sea. Peter's boat, piloted by the Pope and escorted by smaller ships, had to counter the assault of many other ships armed with physical and spiritual weapons. Contrary winds and rough seas seemed to favor the enemies, but in the middle of the sea there were two very tall columns. In the first, there was a large host. The Eucharist was at the top, and in the other there was a statue of the Immaculate Virgin Mary in the dome with the sign, Help of Christians. From both columns hung numerous anchors and thick rings attached to robust chains so that the ship would be moored safely. It was a clear invitation to safety. Faced with the terrible attack by the enemies, the Pope, who directs Peter's boat, summoned all the pilots of the smaller ships, the bishops and cardinals, to a council on the flagship to decide what to do in the face of the attack. But as weather conditions became dangerous, the commanders of the smaller ships were sent back to their ships without any visible results. Then came a kind of sea breeze coming from the two columns, which partially repaired the damage, and immediately the Pope calls for a new council. But the enemies attacked again furiously. The Pope falls seriously wounded, but then gets up, and then he's wounded a second time, and this time he dies, while the enemies rejoice. A new Pope is immediately elected, who holds the helm of the flagship tightly in his hands, setting a determined course towards the two columns while the enemies begin to lose heart. Then the Pope's flagship manages to tie the ship to the column where the Holy Host was and to the one that had the Virgin Mary, Help of Christians. And when this happens, there was a great confusion among the enemy ships, scattering and colliding with each other, sinking and destroying each other in a chain. And on the other hand, other ships that had retreated due to fear of combat and were distant observing the events, upon seeing the defeat of the enemy ships, sailed quickly towards the two columns, and there remained calm and serene in the company of the flagship, directed by the Pope, and an absolute calm reigned on the sea. What does this prophecy of Don Bosco tell us? Like all Catholic prophecies, these are truths that are not exhausted in historical time, but rather occur more than once. When St. John Bosco explained his dream, he commented, "I predict that some of the greatest tests in the history of the Catholic Church will be in the next century." I was talking about the 20th century. He further said, "God is giving only two means to defend His Church. The first is devotion to Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament, and the second is devotion to our Blessed Lady." And I add, what has happened so far is almost nothing compared to what has to happen. The Church must go through critical times and suffer serious damage, but in the end, heaven itself will intervene to save it. Afterwards, peace will come, and there will be a new and vigorous flowering in the Church. The dream of the two columns showed that the enemies had all kinds of instruments for attack, physical and spiritual weapons, such as books. And they fiercely attack Peter's boat, who has in front of him and visibly the two columns, the two references that heaven shows him to anchor safely. One is the Eucharist, that is the presence of the invisible Jesus among us, and the other is the devotion to the Blessed Virgin, who, as we know, has the leadership of the people of God as co-redemptrix in the end times. This was made explicit in the Fatima apparitions and in many others. The dream also shows that in the midst of the furious attacks of the enemies, from time to time a cool breeze comes from the columns that helps the Christians. In other words, in the midst of the battle, God is present, acting, comforting his children, and preserving them. But in the midst of the fight, and instead of holding tightly to the helm to head towards the safe place of the columns of the Eucharist and the Virgin Mary, the Pope calls a council of bishops and cardinals, who have to be interrupted by an attack redoubling of the enemy. And then, when an oasis of certain tranquility happens, it calls for a second council, and this is interrupted again because the Pope is wounded, recovers, and then is wounded a second time and dies. This is a clear allusion to the Synod of Synodality that seems to try to reinvent the wheel, diverting enormous amounts of efforts and resources, and generating confusion and uncertainty among Christians. Then in the dream of the two columns, a new pope is named who firmly takes the helm of the flagship in his hands. And then the prophecy says that the enemies began to lose heart, and he manages to tie the nave between the two columns, the Holy Host and the Holy Virgin. In other words, when the Pope wastes time in consultations and indecisions about how to defend himself instead of looking at what the Church has done in the last 20 centuries, he is wounded and dies. That is, he becomes ineffective and loses. On the other hand, when it does not waste time and effort in consultations about what must be done to combat the enemies, it firmly takes the helm and focuses only on the two historical columns of our faith. Triumph comes. And the triumph occurs in a mysterious way, as has happened so many times in history. For example, most recently with Soviet communism, through the fall of the Berlin Wall. Mysteriously, the enemy loses strength and disperses, and on the other hand, this fact strengthens the Church in another additional way. Because those who did not know what position to take, who were consumed by doubt, who were afraid, now approach the Church again, and the triumph is consolidated even more. Well, that's it for what we wanted to tell about the teachings for our time from Don Bosco's dream of the two columns. And I would like to ask if you believe that this prophecy is indeed a message for what is happening with the Synod of Synodality or not. Thank you for joining us. May God bless you and keep you, and may the Immaculate Heart of Mary be your refuge. Amen.